My name is Birgit Schneider. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, and my profession is cultural and media studies. I'm doing research in climate images and imaginaries in science and culture at University of Potsdam. And the reason for the following interview is the pressing question of what we can do better or maybe also completely differently in climate change communication. And to discuss this question, we invited several speakers. It was important to us to juxtapose voices from different fields of study and to combine perspectives also from different countries. And my guest for this interview is Lynda Olman, Professor Dr. Lynda Olman. She's a professor of English at the University of Nevada in Reno, United States. And her main research interest is the rhetoric of science, and particularly the public reception of visual arguments and of the ethos of or public role of the scientist. I welcome you today, Lynda, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Birgit. It's great to be here. It's good to see you.
So I would like to start with a very basic question. As a rhetorician, what is your interest in and approach to climate visualizations? So why is rhetoric of science important when it comes to climate change communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. So rhetoric has always been sort of an interstitial art. It's a discipline that's in the connective tissue among other disciplines. So we sort of inhabit the spaces between political science, psychology, communication studies, sociology, and just like Socrates, who made his living going from dinner table to dinner table and mooching off other people, rhetoric kind of resonates among these other disciplines, taking knowledge and material and refocusing it in a certain way. And that special focus that rhetoric has is on democracy. It's on polity. So the idea of polity is a group of people who have to work together to stay together. And this is rhetoric's special focus. So when we come to something like climate change visualization, the questions that we ask about it, we use research done by psychologists, social scientists, political scientists, et cetera. But the questions that rhetoricians ask about climate visualizations are what kinds of polities or communities are coalesced around those visualizations, or in what ways do those visualizations serve to break up communities, to factionalize communities. So we're really interested in the political, it's small p political, meaning community effects of climate visualizations. So that's the special angle that rhetoricians bring to the study of climate visualization.
And how would you apply this to climate graphics? So this is what you do. You study climate visualizations from the sciences, among others. And so rhetoric study, how do you study the processes by which people are visually persuaded? Or how do such graphics make an argument?
Yeah, so and when we study how people are visually persuaded, again, we're interested in the community aspect of that, because psychologists are quite good at explaining how an individual person perhaps is persuaded by a graphic, by the color combinations or the arguments. But as a rhetorician, I'm interested in the ways in which that visualization persuades that people to seek, the viewers to seek common ground with each other or with other people in the community. So we do this in a couple of different ways. One is that we look for the encoding of community values in graphics, and I do that a fair amount. So it's a hermeneutic process by which we look for the encoding of community values. So those can show up as conventions like, hey, red, the color red means something is alarming or threatening to the community. So those things that are traditionally treated as semiotic conventions can properly be understood as a community value or norm as well, because that's where they came from. People didn't just make that up on their own. It's not like one person thinks red is alarming and the next person thinks it's completely okay. They are community conventions as well. So we look at things like that, but we also look for community norms like structural norms like comparison and contrast, change over time, cause and effect, division. So these kind of, they're called topoi. So these universal ways of laying out information in order to draw out certain dominant relationships in those graphics, those are also community norms. They're sort of structural ones. We look for community norms in terms of the values that are represented in the graphic. So if certain categories or concepts are represented, like change in economic status, then we know that's important to that community. Whereas something else might be left out, change in health and welfare may be left out of a graphic, which means that that community doesn't value that as much. So we look for the encoding of community values in the graphic. That's one way that we analyze how a visual may persuade a community or factionalize a community. The other thing we do is we look at the reception of that. So we do reception studies, and we look at the reception of that visualization within certain communities. So we look at, I've spent a lot of time reading blogs written by climate deniers, for instance, looking at how they receive the hockey stick graphic, things like that. So we study how graphics are, we look at reception data and study how graphics are actually received by individual communities and look for evidence of coalescing or coalition or factionalization around graphics. So those are two ways that we do that. We can actually look at the graphic itself as a record and inscription of community norms and values, or we can look at the way that the graphic is actually being received in the real world reception is a word I don't actually super love. I like co-constitution. It kind of ties into co-production. So that way that graphic is co-constituted or co-produced in a particular community. And we look at what's typically called reception data to do that work.
Mm-hmm. And what is happening when such graphs, which are produced in scientific contexts, when they change or when they migrate into the realm of politics or communities who are not part of the scientific sphere? I know that you once talked about the is and ought divide to differentiate these two spheres. So what do climate change communicators have to know about this change?
Well, there's one thing that's pretty certain about that change, and it's a dynamic called accommodation. And it's been known, I think it's been known for at least 30 years since Jean Fonestock wrote about it, Jean Fonestock and Marie Secor. But accommodation is the tendency of an argument to move up stasis, which means to move from questions of fact is to questions of values and norms, the ought. So to move from ontological issues to deontological issues as it moves to a wider and wider public, or wider and wider polity. So we do know that there's sort of like it's what I've called an upward pull, and what's sometimes called accommodation. So accommodation actually is the side of it when scientists change their message for other audiences. So that's, to be clear, accommodation is more of a author function. So when a scientist knows they're talking to the public, for instance, they will shift up stasis. They'll talk less about the facts and more about what they mean or the value of them. Values like novelties, like, ooh, look at this cool thing we found, or, look, this is going to solve this big problem. So that process of accommodation happens, but also when graphics themselves travel outside, with irrespective of author intentions, when graphics travel outside of their immediate political context of production, they also drift up stasis, and that's what I call the upward pull. Mm-hmm. So you see that whether the author intends that or not of the graphic, you see that that rhetorical effect, that rhetorical dynamic of it shifting from more ontological interpretations to more deontological interpretations. Mm-hmm. So that's the main effect that we see. There are, of course, other ones where when it moves outside of the community of production, of course, the codes will all be changed. The way that the codes are understood will all be changed. So color coding, for instance, there's an interesting subfield. Seismologists use a color scale that is the reverse of most people's intuitive color scale. So red things are slow and blue things are fast. So when you look at like an earthquake diagram and you see blue, that actually means like you should be alarmed by that because things are moving very quickly. But when those graphics travel out into publics, the public may misunderstand them because the coding is opposite of what the sort of the native or natural interpretation of blue being alarming, blue being calm and red being alarming. This is exactly the opposite. So you can have some of the codings will be misunderstood or changed. And Charlie Kostelnik has written a lot about that, about sort of the special codings of color and line in technical graphics and how those are easily reinterpreted or misinterpreted when they leave their context of production. So that's something else that can happen. It's just that they, the wider publics don't have the Rosetta Stone for reading the graphics that were created by a group of climate scientists. And unless those graphics were specifically designed for wider audiences, there's going to be a fair amount of crossed wires and misinterpretation of the coding in those graphics, because the public just doesn't have access to those special codes.
So maybe we can also talk about some examples later on. But now I would like to ask you, reading your impulse paper, you were asked, I could ask that, when are visualizations the most politically useful? At what scale? Because you have a strong idea about scale, the scale of such graphics and maps, scientific maps.
Yeah. Well, you and I have talked a lot about this and are continuing to talk a lot about this. So my thinking is very much in progress on this, but what I've noticed is that, and it's not just me, a lot of science communication researchers have noticed that the global scale of climate visualizations is problematic for empowering local communities to take climate action. People can feel overwhelmed by seeing global images because they feel, oh, well, if it's happening in the whole world, there's nothing that little old me is going to be able to do to fix it. It can be, the scale is problematic because it's not a fine enough grain to be able to see the local effects and know, hey, is my community warming? I remember looking at a projection, for instance, of in the Western US of what temperatures were projected to do. And I remember, because I lived near a mountain area, and it was right in an area between where the projection was uncertain whether it was going to get wetter and cooler as a result of climate change, or if it was going to get hotter and drier. And I remember thinking, oh, well, which one is it, right? So global scale graphics are not at the scale that can be helpful for local citizens in Boulder, Colorado, to make decisions about where to put their resources in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. So that started with the notion of the global, or what are called synoptic, right? Like the God's eye view graphics of the whole world, that they are at some level not politically useful. And again, political in this sense is like in the sense of polity. And what I realized looking at these graphics is you can only take action at the scale of functional polity, and there is no functional polity at the global level. We could make arguments about the UN and things like that, but we all know that the UN doesn't take action to affect the entire globe. So there is no truly global polity, and so there can be no truly global climate action, political action. So I started out thinking, okay, how can we scale the visualization of climate to the size of polity, to effective polity? So this could be, this could be nation scale, of course. This could be local scale. I've gotten increasingly interested in very small scale, like the scale of a village, the scale of a town, the scale of a city, a large city like San Francisco. I've gotten more interested in those size of polities because though I feel like they're more coherent polities, people have more skin in the game with each other. They have more consubstantiality, as Kenneth Burke would say. They can feel each other's pain if there's poisoned water over here or wildfires in Reno. Like I was, as we were talking about before we started filming, I was texting all night with my friends whose houses were threatened by wildfires in the foothills. I was consubstantial with them. I felt some of their anxiety as they were waiting to see if their houses were safe. And that embodied sense of having skin in the game together, I think can be very effective for political action. So I'm getting more and more interested in ways to visualize climate change at the level of a city like Reno, creating visualizations that don't ignore the global visualizations, because let's face it, we wouldn't even know climate change was a problem if we didn't have the global visualizations. But what can I do to create visualizations that will help my city take sustainable, resilient climate action? So, finding ways to articulate local views of climate with global ones. And I feel like one way that that's happening here is thinking more about weather. So, for years, climate scientists told us, don't talk about weather. It's not the same as climate. But now when I talk to climate scientists, they're saying, well, we probably shouldn't have been telling people that, because they can, if they live in an area like Reno, they can see it get hotter and drier every year, and the snowpack get less and less, and ski season start later and later every year and end earlier and earlier. They can see those things with their own eyes. And if we've been telling them for years not to trust their own senses, then we're disabling them from having a stake in the political action. So the climate scientists that I know that I work with here are starting to talk more about weather with people. So I'm involved in a project right now that is trying to use rhetoric to tap into that sort of skin in the game, that sense of common consubstantiality, those common values and norms that people have, in order to improve the forecasting of hazards like wildfires and snowstorms and floods, to get people to take action, collective action in terms of sandbagging their neighborhood for a flood, and also individual action as in don't drive over that pass, it's going to snow really badly, or hey, you need to evacuate from your house. Trying to get people to take action based on a sense of sort of community and shared responsibility. And the local weather office here has been trying some of this stuff on their own without me helping them at all, and it's been really successful. And so now we're trying to study why what they did worked and how to do that more. And the idea is we can form, again, it's about community formation. It's not about like creating a great graphic. It's about creating a robust community. Because if I can create what I like to call a collective. So if we can create a robust collective that involves experts from the National Weather Service and grandma, right, and my friends in their houses, if I can create a robust collective to deal with a flood or a snowstorm or a wildfire, then I have a robust collective that I can also tap to take action on climate change. So for me, if this stuff is happening at the level of the community or the collective, then strengthening those community bonds using weather forecasting sets the groundwork for then coming into those same collectives and say, hey, now let's take some community action. Let's try to long-term adapt or mitigate to make this a more resilient collective.
I would like to add another question. So, we already started to get into this. When do climate visualizations or within these communities bridge the gap between the experts and the non-experts, as we tend to call them, successfully? So you were thinking about already telling us about these successful entry points to do this.
Yeah. So from a rhetorical perspective, you successfully bridge the gap between experts and non-experts by putting them in a collective, putting them in a community together. And what that means functionally, rhetorically, is they share common values, norms, and beliefs about something. So that's the way we recognize other people who are in polity with us, is they share a certain covenant set of norms, values, and beliefs that we organize around. And not so secretly, I'm a second wave science studies person. And so I do believe that in breaking down the boundaries between expert and non-expert communities as much as possible, because I think they're often not there, or if they are there, they're efforts at demarcation in order to accrue special resources or status to the experts, that I think in fighting something like climate change are the opposite of helpful. They're the opposite of useful. They're unproductive. They're not useful to kind of create those demarcations. In those situations, I think we need to start recognizing that there's a lot of expertise already in that community about climate, especially in indigenous communities like on the Navajo reservation. There are often very long-standing records of climate and climate change, and there are often very effective traditional means for dealing with and adapting to and mitigating climate change. And this is an area I'm particularly passionate about, because I think this is an area that especially climate experts, haven't tapped enough, is local and indigenous knowledges of climate. So I think in the instance that in this toy instance that we're talking about of having a village on the Navajo reservation, if a climate scientist wanted to engage with that, obviously the best choice would be to identify a Navajo climate scientist, if possible, or someone with training that's close enough to interface with that community. If not, then the white climate scientist has to go to the village and as much as possible start asking them questions about their practices. How do you deal with this? How have you dealt with that? How have you dealt with drought? And how have you dealt with floods? How have you dealt with fires? And there are answers to all of those questions. That those villages are very resilient in very sparse circumstances, because they have been able to leverage considerable expertise in adapting to climate change over the last, in the case of the communities that we're talking about here, about the last 1,000 years roughly. So we need to, in those cases, we need to pay more attention to the expertise that's already on the ground rather than importing some sort of white Western understanding of climate change to those situations. And more climate scientists are starting to recognize this. This is not just something that I'm like, we should do this and we're not doing it. More and more climate scientists are starting to recognize indigenous knowledge bases and to try to work with those. I think I give the example in my Impulse paper of the Power Coup project, and that's a good example in outback Western Australia of how environmental scientists have started to tap into in that case, 50,000-year-old record of climate change and climate adaptation. I mean, what we've been measuring temperature for maybe 150 years. In Potsdam, how far does the record go back? It's like 150 years, something like that. And we're talking about a community here that has a 50,000-year record of dealing with climate change. I want to see the scientists, whoever they are, Navajo or white or whatever, and the local community on this reservation, I want to see them stay in dialogue with each other, even and especially when they don't agree with each other, and have to negotiate action between. Now, this isn't impasse either. It's not like nothing ever gets done or nothing ever gets decided. That's different. But one doesn't get resolved to the other. That's the really important part, is that the Navajo worldview stays intact and the sort of Western scientific view stays intact, but they can hybridize with each other in small sort of political solutions, but not one of them gets subsumed to the other. That's what I'm particularly concerned about. I don't really want to see scientists come into the Navajo reservation and make them do things the white Western way, because it won't be sustainable. And it's not respectful of this community. So I want to see these two kinds of ideologies stay intact, but them from bumping up against each other, little pieces kind of break off and hybridize into solutions that are like maybe not entirely satisfying to either side, but have pieces of both of them in it. And that, I think, is the most, to me, that's the ideal situation, because it means these two sides are staying in contact, staying in community with each other.
You are also highlighting the necessity to communicate uncertainties.
How do you act in a situation in which uncertainty will never be reduced to certainty? How do you act under conditions of uncertainty? How do you stay in a collective under conditions of uncertainty? And that's what rhetoric deals with. And so it has a lot to offer scientists who are trying to communicate around climate change, uncertainties around climate change. The reason why it's so important to communicate around climate uncertainties specifically is because we're never going to not have them. We're always going to be uncertain about how warm it's going to get, whether or not we're going to have more hurricanes, what those hurricanes are going to be like. There's always going to be uncertainty around those things. And if we wait for a sort of ideal mathematical future in which all of that will be resolved and we will know exactly what steps to take, it'll be too late. That day will never come.
What is your idea of hybrid visualizations? So this is again a shift of topic, of course. Now we return to the question of useful, helpful visualization tools.
Yeah, we think that rhetoric is all about talking, but honestly, the art of rhetoric is about listening to what people are saying, to listen for those norms and values, to create common ground with people. So the forecasters exercised rhetorical principles. They listened to the community, they identified this commonplace, and they folded it back into their forecast visualization. So it had like an image, it had the probabilities for the storm, it had a pretty standard like precipitation graph with the probabilities for deposition, and then they added this commonplace to it. And it's interesting because the forecasters at this weather office have gotten in trouble sometimes for creating hybrid graphics. It's called a freakout chart. So they have a chart of like precipitation, snow, fire, wind, or whatever, and then they have the days of the week. And then they have a color coding system that's just like stoplights. It's just like red, yellow, or green. And then they have little smiley faces that get more and more alarmed looking. And then, so for each quadrant, they map a different color and a different smiley face to like how bad the impacts are going to be that week. People love the freakout chart. And not people like me who don't know anything about the weather. They send this out to their email list of pretty much like decision maker partners. So people who have to decide to get the snowplows out, whether or not the schools are going to open, whether or not to deploy fire services, they get this freakout chart, and it's a hybrid of humor and like the little ASCII, little old school ASCII emojis, And a humor and a stoplight color scheme is definitely a hybrid of a like aesthetic and humorous graphic with a scientific graphic. And they use a verbal and visual scale that breaks technical uncertainties and confidence estimates down into these like, time to freak out, time to totally freak out. That one is a little smiley face with like swirly eyes. He's great. Little at symbols for eyes. So time to totally freak out. And then on this end is like, no worries. But it's a technical scale of uncertainty and of likelihood and confidence that's been broken down into this kind of colloquial scale. And it works like gangbusters. It's super effective. We're putting in this grant right now, I mentioned, and I was teasing everyone that we're just going to sit around for 2 years and then give them the freak out chart at the end and be like, we did it. We figured out how to do this, how to communicate weather uncertainties, probabilistic hazard information successfully. It's called the freak out chart. Here you go. You're welcome. Mm-hmm. We're not going to do that, but it's an extraordinarily effective hybrid graphic. So those are just some examples, in addition to the one in the Impulse paper, that's kind of an example of what I'm finding to be particularly effective at the local level.
Thank you so much, Lynda, for sharing your ideas and for taking the time to talk to us. And thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.